A person's home country is often closely tied to their identity. Even countries with similarities like the United States, Canada, and England have their own customs and heritage that makes the people born there unique. It's easy to assume that continuing to call your country home is your birthright. After all, you were born there and citizenship is all you know. Sometimes, though, outsiders can take that birthright away. Today, Scotland is a sparsely populated country, with most of its 5.5 million citizens living inside one of its 7 major cities. In fact, the population is so low given its size, it's often rightfully joked that there are more Scots living in places like Canada than there are in Scotland itself. But it wasn't always that way. Back in the 1700s, the country was a lot busier with various clans that called Scotland home. That was until the Highland Clearances took place and forced many in the northern part of the nation out of their homes forever. In 1707, economic troubles in Scotland led them to having no choice but to form a partnership with their southern neighbours England, a partnership that would go on to become known as the United Kingdom. While such a union later went on to include Wales and at times parts of Ireland, it was always the tense divide between the original 2 nations that, in many ways, defined the early instability of the UK. As a result of them throwing their hat in with England, the Scots had managed to rescue themselves from certain financial destruction, but that didn't mean many of the citizenry there were happy about being tied to them long term. That was because there had always been a rivalry between the 2 countries even prior to that. As a result of the new situation, said rivalry was now able to create a rift within the northern lands themselves. It turned out that a lot of people living in the southern part of Scotland felt like the old feudal clan system they were still living under was backwards and out of date, and that in order for them to grow as a nation, they'd have to start adopting more of the central governance style that was being practiced by their neighbors below them. Meanwhile, up north in the Highlands, the general consensus was that such a belief was ridiculous and that what the Scots really needed was to protect their culture and traditions which had by then stood for generations. As far as they were concerned, it was adhering to that way of life that allowed them to fend off the advances of both the Nords and the Romans in the past. But for as much as the Highland clans might have been dedicated to their history, the reality was power had already been seeping from their culture for a long time prior. As early as 1603, in fact, when James VI, then King of Scotland, ascended to the throne in England as well, and he decided to abandon his homeland and their way of doing things to move down south full-time and rule both countries from there instead, with him only visiting the north once more after. Clearly then, England was the real center of influence at that point, and that influence would only increase as the decades went on and James's reign continued. In fact, a full century and a half before the Highland Clearances saw the various clan leaders of the northern country be stripped of their power, he'd be doing pretty much the same thing to them when he had those chiefs spend several months out of each year away from their people as they traveled to London in order to pay an annual tribute to the crown. A strategy that he hoped would maintain their loyalty to him and not their local leaders. In the end, they did pledge their loyalty to James, so much so that after he died in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 saw William of Orange forcibly take over as king, a series of rebellions in the form of the Jacobite uprisings began. These uprisings were designed to install the former king's descendant, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, colloquially known as Bonnie Prince Charles, onto the throne as the way the Scots saw it he was the real heir. Even after Scotland signed the Acts of Union in 1707 and created the United Kingdom in the process, the Jacobite rebellions continued to wage. It could be argued that they got even worse as, with many Scots now feeling betrayed by their leaders for having joined forces with England, support for the rebels only grew. Still, not everyone was in the fighting mood. No, as alluded to earlier, many living in the lowlands saw the English way of life as being superior on account of it being less barbaric than what was going on up north in the Highlands. That ultimately left the Scottish rebel fighters somewhat weakened both in manpower and morale as they continued in vain in their efforts to put their man on the throne and, in the process, reinstate their sense of sovereignty. Yes, despite their best efforts, the rule of Bonnie Prince Charlie was never destined to come to fruition. That was something the Scots were finally forced to come to terms with during the final and bloodiest of all the rebellions in 1745 and 1746, one that was led by the would-be king himself. At the Battle of Culloden during the latter year, the Jacobite troops faced off against the English redcoats in an open field and quickly realized they were no match for their opponents as they outnumbered them by 3-2. Rather than come out of that one victorious and continue on their march towards London, the Northerners were absolutely slaughtered, with an estimated 1,000 Scots dying in that one battle alone. And that wasn't all, because hundreds more were captured and taken back down to England, where they'd either be kept behind bars for the rest of their lives or outright executed. In fact, one of those prisoners, Lord Lovat, the clan chief of Fraser, would be the last man ever to be beheaded in the UK. Needless to say then, that loss pretty much cut the heart out of the Scots and brought the Jacobite rebellion to both a symbolic and literal end. It would also mark the beginning of the end for the clan society way of life as well. A way of life that the country, at least in the Highlands, had held on to so dearly for such a long period of time. Why was that? Well, wanting to ensure no further rebellions arose in the future that might threaten the union between Scotland and England, the Act of Proscription was formally passed by Parliament in 1747. An act that made it illegal for not only clan tartan to be worn by anyone north of the border, but also for bagpipes to be played or Gaelic, the native language of the Scots, to be taught to children. As if that wasn't enough, later that same year another piece of legislation, the Heritable Justices Act, would also be passed, with it decreeing that any Scot who didn't submit to English rule going forward would forfeit their land. Basically then, such laws were designed to break the spirit of the northern nation and put an end to the feudal clan system with one swift movement, as local leaders were now no longer in control of their own land. Rather, they were merely watching over it for the real power, their southern counterparts. Of course, it wasn't as if England had been quietly interfering with such a way of life for decades anyway, because as far back as the 1710s, they'd realized the clan system no longer made any sense from an economic and agricultural perspective in the world they now lived in. No, with many landowners running into large amounts of debt and undergoing huge food shortages on account of them not being able to farm efficiently during poor weather conditions, there really was no need for it anymore. That was why, pretty much as soon as the Union began, it was determined by those in power down south that a serious change was going to be needed north of the border if it was going to be brought into the modern day. After all, with famine now being a semi-common occurrence and the debt only getting worse with each passing year, it didn't benefit anyone for things to continue on as they were. What was needed instead, as far as the English rulers saw it, was to deal with the problem in a radical way. Not by increasing production of food and other produce, but by trimming down the population up north. That way, less food would be needed overall, and any future financial issues could be solved by using the extra space that had now been freed up for different, more fruitful methods of agriculture. Still, given the Union had only just begun a few years before, such a grand move couldn't be instituted on a wide scale quite yet, especially not when the Scots were in the midst of a rebellion. So, rather than do that, the English decided to test the idea in a far quieter way when they had all the Campbells of Kintyre's properties put up for auction early in the decade, forcing many of their clan members to have to migrate elsewhere if they wanted to find work. With them soon seeing the positive effects of that when it came to how much better the land could be used in order to make money for the crown, it meant once the chance to go all in on the idea arose post-Honourable Justices Act, England did so with glee. With Scotland now weaker than ever on account of their clan rights being stripped away, they were left ripe for rampant seizures of their estates and general takeovers of their land, with the working class people who'd made a living there before now often being replaced with livestock which could be better monetized. Now that their homes and livelihoods had been upturned, where would the people go? Anywhere that would take them, quite frankly, and that meant a lot of native Scots found themselves going over to the New World of North America to make a new life for themselves there. Obviously then, while that was the America's gain, it was devastating for the small northern nation in the long run. To give an example of just how much that period ransacked the land of its people, on the Isle of Skye alone, one of the many small Highland islands located off the coast of mainland Scotland, more than 40,000 locals were served with writs of removal during the first stage of the clearances alone. It's easy to see the effect this had, not just because it separated people from their friends and loved ones, but also because it meant a large part of the local culture would be leaving with those who'd been forced out. Basically, it was the death of Dúchas, a belief among Scots that allegiance to your clan and as a consequence your local community came above all else. But it wasn't like everyone who was evicted suddenly crossed the ocean and left their homeland altogether. There were a select few who chose to stay behind and either move closer to the coasts where they hoped to find work as fishermen, or head down to the lowlands instead where the Industrial Revolution was creating more modern jobs. As for the settlements they'd left behind though, well, they'd now mostly be populated with sheep, with the reason for that being the English landowners had determined that sheep farming was a far more efficient way of running the fertile land in order to create maximum profits. It didn't matter that people had been kicked out of their homes in order to achieve that, of course, only that the money was now rolling in. As Karl Marx put it himself, in fact, when later writing on the Highland Clearances, quote, "Sheeps were introduced into glens, which had been the seats of communities of small farmers, and the latter were driven to seek substance on coarser and more sterile tracts of soil." Why was Karl Marx so interested in what was happening in Scotland during the 1700s? Well, with him being considered the father of communism, it's no surprise he'd see that as an early example of capitalism run amok. And as fate would have it, it wouldn't be the end of the clearances either, as in the 1810s a second phase began, one which was largely brought about as the result of the close of the Napoleonic Wars. Basically, what happened was that during the aforementioned wars, the UK government had found great and unforeseen value in a type of seaweed called kelp. That was because, when burned, it produced an alkali named beryllia that was hugely important for the wartime industry. So, as a result of that, the remaining fishermen of Scotland who were able to bring in kelp by the barrel load suddenly became hugely valuable, and their southern landlords began imposing further emigration measures as they wanted to keep as many of them in place as possible. Such a change in circumstance actually led to a brief uptake for the Scots' financial fortunes as, while most of the money still went down south, around £500,000 was injected into the northern economy. On top of that, an increase in need for fishing had led to a total of 50,000 Highlanders being employed as well, a significant turnaround from where things had been during the immediate aftermath of the first stage of the clearances. Unfortunately though, once the Napoleonic Wars drew to a close, that need quickly lessened and the brief uptake in both work and money that was being enjoyed in Scotland came to an abrupt end. And to make matters worse, it turned out most of the money that had been injected into the country during that period had not been spent on improving infrastructure or stimulating other economic activities. Meaning, once the dust settled, there was a desire amongst the English to remove more Scots from their homes, as the way they saw it, the lands to the north were once again overpopulated with people who were making it a financially non-viable location to own. So began the second stage of the Highland Clearances as, between 1815 and the 1850s, tens of thousands more people were evicted from their lands and forced to quickly try to find a home elsewhere, all while their English landlords made out like bandits in the process, of course. And of the people who benefited from that period, perhaps none were more infamous than Patrick Sellor. During one of the most notable individual episodes of the time period, the Sutherland Clearances, Sellor had been employed by the Countess of Sutherland in order to help her coordinate the evictions of anyone who had to go. That was a role he took on with such glee that it actually became enjoyable for him, partially because he already had a plan in mind to later rent some of the cleared lands himself and use them for large-scale commercial sheep farming. That said, lots of people were looking to make some money out of what was happening, so such an attitude alone shouldn't have been enough to make Sellor so vilified amongst the Scots. What really pushed him over the edge into complete monsterdom for the locals was an incident that took place not long after the second stage of the clearances began when, once he'd served an eviction notice to William Chisholm and his family and gave them what he felt was an ample amount of time to leave their property, he burned said property to the ground. What he didn't realize at that point, though, was that, when he set the fire, Chisholm's bedridden mother-in-law was still inside. While Seller would quickly see his mistake and order his people to go in and rescue her, the smoke inhalation she suffered led to the woman dying just 6 days later. News of what had happened quickly spread and the local populace understandably became outraged. After all, being evicted from their home and being deprived of the ability to make a livelihood for themselves was one thing, but now that they were being outright murdered as far as they saw it, the Scots had finally reached their breaking point. So, in order to try and bring about some justice, Robert Mackey, a local man who already held an existing vendetta against Patrick Seller, decided to file charges against him and take him to court for the dual crimes of arson and murder. While his goal might have been to get a conviction and perhaps even do some damage to the clearance movement in the process, it all ultimately backfired as Seller ended up being acquitted on all counts. Still though, even if he was technically deemed to be innocent of his crimes, the public perception of his guilt would continue on for a long time north of the border. So much so that even other English landowners started to take notice of the methods that were being used to evict people, as they didn't want to end up involved in a scandal just as the Sutherlands had. Unfortunately, that would not be the only death that came about as a direct result of people being forcibly removed from their homes. No, just over a decade later in 1826, passengers who were on board a boat headed from the Isle of Rum to Canada all died when they were exposed to typhus while on board. In a way, they were the lucky ones, as some others who didn't die of general poor health brought about by their new circumstances were actually sold into indentured servitude. And even that wouldn't be as bad as things got, because as the 1840s rolled around, a whole new disaster arose in the form of a particularly devastating potato famine. That's right, poor weather conditions had led to a decrease in crop production all over again, and, as a result, what was already a difficult life for those still living in the Highlands now became completely untenable. That led to even more emigration, as most people realized they simply had no hope of survival if they stayed where they were. And even if they didn't realize that at first, they were often incentivized to do so by the Immigration Advances Act, which was passed in 1851, allowing landowners to financially assist the poor in leaving their estates. Even then, some stubborn Scots stuck by their guns and remained where they were. And for those who remained, some hope was about to appear on the horizon, as by now, the public down south had become far more aware of what was happening in the Highlands of Scotland, and they were actually beginning to grow sensitive to their plight. It wouldn't be the kind hearts of the English who rescued the Scots from their misery in the end, however. No, it was the Scots who ultimately did that themselves when in 1882, the Battle of the Braes took place. A battle that saw a group of local crofters stage a rebellion of their own against not only their landlord who was attempting to evict them, but also the police who had been brought in to help him do so. Once that was over, realizing things couldn't continue on as they were, the UK government created a royal commission to formally look into the conditions the working classes were living under up north, with the findings of that commission eventually leading to the creation of the Crofters Holdings Act in 1886, something that protected workers from arbitrary eviction or extortionate rents, and finally, mercifully signaling the end of the Highland Clearances. But while it might have now been over, the effects of such clearances would be felt for generations thereafter. Even today, in fact, the Highlands of Scotland remain sparsely populated, and those who do live and work there are often continuing to do so under the thumb of richer landowners. The effects this has had on the psyche of the nation as a whole remain strong, as the anger many Scots have towards their English neighbours can still be felt in just about any area of the country. In many ways, the Highland Clearances could be seen as the defining event of modern Scottish history, as it shaped the mentality of the people who lived there so much it might never fully be repaired. And given that mentality is often one of inferiority and persecution with regards to the way they feel they're being treated by those down south, it has to rank as one of the most damaging events the UK has ever produced. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.